This is lecture 133 in the ABCs of Communism series that accompanies volume 8, which is forthcoming, on communism in North America before white contact. And our subject today is going to be the road to the Tamaulipas Road. And the reason is, I think I want to, you probably know where this is, but I'm going to just pull up this map real quick and show you that what we're talking about is, this is this Mexican state of Tamaulipas, and it leads right, it's on the Gulf of Mexico. It comes straight up from the high culture areas of farther south, and then along the whole Gulf Coast here. This was an area that had to be traversed in order for the Mexican domesticates to get to the eastern woodlands of the USA. Now, you may recall there was an asteroid impact 66 million years ago that sent a tidal wave over a mile high, carrying huge chunks of crust onto the mainland of what's now Texas and adjoining states, created the inland mountains there, and washed this whole area clean. So that's how it got to be so flat, and such a geologically how it got to be so flat and connected. And then now, the Tamaulipas, Texas coastline, as we see it today, is only about 3,000 years old. Before 11,000 BP, that area of the modern shoreline was high and dry. The Gulf Coast far to the east of its present position, because the global sea level was over 300 feet lower. Now, as sea level rose, the shoreline moved progressively farther inland. By 10,000 years ago, the sea had inundated major river valleys along the Texas coast. The flooding of the valleys of major streams, such as the Trinity, La Vaca, Guadalupe, Aransas, and Nueces rivers, created the earliest forms of our modern coastal bays, respectively Galveston, Matagorda, San Antonio, Copano, and Corpus Christi. Now, the same occurred at the mouths of the Brazos and Rio Grande rivers, and there the heavy sediment loads of clay, silt, and sand carried by these rivers filled in whatever early bays were created by that sea level rise. Now, after this time, sea level continued to rise until relatively recently, but at a slower rate. Many geologists have suggested that rising sea level was not gradual or continuous, but rather that it was intermittent, with periods of rise interrupted by intervals of stable sea level. I know that's the case. I used to log wells. There are about 5,000 wells offshore in the Gulf of Mexico here, many of which are connected by bridges, and at night they're all lit up, and if you fly in from Mexico City or from Villahermosa, you think you're over a major city, but you're actually a couple hundred miles offshore. At any rate, by 3,000 years ago, the sea level reached its modern position and has since then been stable. With sea level at a standstill, ongoing wave action and longshore drift, deposited sand and shell mash parallel to the mainland formed the modern chain of barrier islands. These are the Padre, Mustang, San Jose, and Matagorda Islands along the middle and lower Texas coast, and Galveston Island and Bolivar Peninsula along the upper Texas coast. Now, there was a major period of shoreline occupation between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago by people fleeing central Mexico. Now, these people carried the domesticates of Mesoamerica and engaged in broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation. There were three major periods of human occupation and resource extraction along the bay shores that correspond with times of stable sea levels, when sea level was at a still stand, ongoing sedimentation of bay bottoms by rivers dropping their sediment loads into the bays created extensive shoreline shallows that supported extensive salt marshes and grass flats. The shallow water featured high rates of photosynthesis. These, combined with the high plant biomass from the marshes and the grass flats, produced the organic nutrients needed to sustain high aquatic biomass and such food chains that were enriched food chains comprised of salt-tolerant plant communities, crustaceans, mollusks, and fish. Now, these environments offered prehistoric hunting and gathering peoples a secure subsistence base, which resulted in their establishing camps along bay shores from which they could obtain a rich harvest of shellfish and fish, and such encampments are in evidence today as the many archaeological shell middens that dot the shores of the bays and lagoons of the Texas coast. In contrast, when sea level was rising more or less rapidly between 6,800 and 6,000 BP and 4,000 to 3,000 BP, the extensive shoreline shallows became more deeply submerged. Now this reduced photosynthesis and depressed biotic productivity, with the result that the bay shores became far less attractive in those periods for prehistoric people. Thus we see a marked reduction in archaeological evidence for these periods along the bay shorelines. Now, I want to return to the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. The road from Mesoamerica to the southeast USA eastern woodlands for incoming domesticated corn, squash, and beans leads through the Mexican coastal state of Tamaulipas and adjoining Texas. And I just showed you the map. And you could, of course, take a look at any map and you'll see this pretty easily. As we have seen in previous chapters and lectures, peoples of the eastern U.S. woodlands were utilizing wild grass seeds to make flour. What they needed was a high-protein grass seed, and therefore they were quite ready to accept the corn carried by the refugees fleeing central Mexico's advanced theocratic chiefdom and slave stage cities when it arrived. In 1945, Richard S. Scotty McNeish went to survey southern Texas and northern Tamaulipas looking for the archaeological evidence that some of these people had passed through the Gulf Coast route. And he was looking for this for his doctoral dissertation in archaeology at the University of Chicago. Now, McNeish found 5 rock shelters in the Cañón Diablo of the Sierra de Tamaulipas. If you want to get a rough idea of what this area looked like at that time, I would suggest you look at a movie made about that time called Treasure of the Sierra Madres, a John Huston movie with a lot of social commentary, because this is when communists still had a role to play in Hollywood. And what's his name? The famous actor at the time who was that played one of the important roles, Bogart. But at any rate, the 3 most important caves McNeish found in Tamaulipas were Nogales, Diablo, and La Perra. Now, protected from rain by the cliffs above and desiccated by high rates of evaporation, these caves were full of prehistoric plant remains, twine, basketry, and other normally perishable artifacts. Now, in 1948, McNeish received a grant from the Viking Fund of the Wenner-Gren Foundation to return to Tamaulipas for an 8-month season. In January of '49, McNeish's Mexican crew chief found 3 tiny early prehistoric maize cobs at La Perra Cave. Now, Scotty since wrote one of those people that contributed to my most famous digs, and he says that he had already packed up and he was leaving, somewhat disappointed that he hadn't found what he was looking for, when this crew chief came running up to him and said, "Look, we just found this little cob." They stopped, they went back to work, and for the next 2 weeks they lived off of Spam and whatever else they could get their hands on. And they dug this up and they sent it to Chicago, where the first ever radiocarbon date was produced. And when he got a date back, it was at 4,500 BP. Now, he knew from looking at it that this was not by far the first corn. The first corn had to be one grass seed on top of a long blade of grass. And this, and it would have been, this is at least much, much older than that. This was a recognizable corn cob, primitive but recognizable. McNeish began his excavation at Nogales Cave using the arbitrary 6-inch levels and WPA Chicago methods he had been taught. By the time he reached La Perra Cave, he had developed his own style of cave excavation. First, he divided the cave floor into a grid of squares. Now, there's a picture of this in my of his work there in Tamaulipas, and the way he divided these in my textbook, Foundations of Archaeology, which we've talked about many times before in this series of lectures. And McNeish wrote the introduction to this, by the way, for me. He was kind enough to do that back in 1976. Well, at any rate, so you'll see a picture of how he was dividing this cave floor into a grid of squares. And then he excavated a small number of alternate squares. This left the natural or cultural stratigraphy of the intervening squares exposed on several sides. Accordingly, it was easier to follow a specific living floor from square to square with the trowel. McNeish would later refer to this system of excavating by natural and/or cultural levels using alternate 1-meter grid squares as the La Pera method, and as I say in my textbook Foundations of Archaeology, there are photographs of this excavation. Now, McNeish's excavations in the Sierra de Tamaulipas had pushed maize agriculture back to 4,500 BP. Along this route to the U.S. southeast, encouraged by botanist Paul Mangelsdorf of Harvard, McNeish turned to the Sierra Madre near Ocampo in southwest Tamaulipas. Javier Romero and Juan Valenzuela of the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History had told him that in 1937 a man named Guerra had led them to mummy-filled dry caves in the Cañón del Infernillo. This is one of the best ways to get information on the ground. That's the way I used to get it all the time in British Columbia, Idaho, and other places. But at any rate, McNeish relocated Guerra, who took him on a harrowing 3-day horseback ride through the wilderness. And the trip ended at 2 magnificent caves, quote unquote, with preservation, sites that Scotty named for the Mexican archaeologists Romero and Valenzuela. In 1953, McNeish returned with 3 assistants to excavate Romero's cave, and it had 17 cultural layers, superb activity areas, baskets, mats, string, wild plants, coprolites, that is fossilized human turds, and early domestic plants. Valenzuela's cave was not as deep, but had equivalent preservation. Bruce Smith of the Smithsonian Institution later reanalyzed and obtained accelerator mass spectrometric, or AMS, dates on many of the cultivars from McNeish's Ocampo caves, and the earliest dates were 6,360 BP for cucurbito pepo, squash, 6,200 BP for bottle gourd, and 4,455 BP for maize. Now, so we know that those domesticates had gotten this far on the first, what you might call a first step of the Tamaulipas Road to the southeast by that time, corn being perhaps most important, by 4,455 years ago, had arrived there. Now, in 1949, McNeish completed a doctoral thesis on his Tamaulipas survey and left Chicago for a job with the National Museum of Canada, which is where I met him in Calgary a few years later, when he and Richard Forbes had just started the first Department of Archaeology, independent of anthropology in the world, and he had obtained financial support from Alberta oil billionaire, a lawyer named Eric Harvey, who had 3 heavily funded foundations that supported our work the whole time I was in Calgary. And he left the day before I got there to go to early class finishing school, Phillips Academy campus, where the R.S. Peabody Foundation had its headquarters, because he had research funds there. Later he told me that George H.W. Bush stole his research funds and used them for other purposes at Phillips Academy. And the thing about the Bush gang is that, like any mafia outfit out of New York, money only goes one way, to them. So even though Bush, of course, was a centimillionaire, if not billionaire by this time, he wasn't going to spend any of his money on anything like that. So he, for the school, so he stole it from Scotty's funds. Anyway, back to our subject. Archaeologically, the Texas coast is divided into 3 basic sections. The upper coast extends from the Sabine River, Sabine Lake area at the Louisiana state line westward to include the Galveston Bay area, and then southward to the vicinity of the mouths of the Brazos and Colorado rivers. Shell middens are in abundance in the Sabine Lake area and along the shorelines of Galveston and Trinity Bays, and camp and burial sites from the Bolivar Peninsula and Galveston Island. The central coast begins, the second part is the central coast. It begins at this point and extends south to the northern shoreline of Baffin Bay. Shell midden sites in this area are found along the shores of all the bays, as well as the leeward shorelines of the barrier islands. And thirdly, the lower coast that extends from the southern shoreline of Baffin Bay down to the Rio Grande Delta area. Shell middens are scarce in this subregion because the waters of Baffin Bay and the lower Laguna Madre are too saline for oysters and other mollusks to survive. Economically useful fish species such as black drum, redfish, and sea trout do well, and fish remains are found in abundance in archaic and late prehistoric campsites along Baffin Bay, Laguna Madre, and in the Rio Grande Delta area. Now, the indigenous coastal peoples, including the ethnographic Karankawa and the Akokisa, featured mixed Stone Age economies, intensive fishing in the shoreline bays and lagoons, hunting of deer, antelope, and bison that foraged and grazed on the prairies and woodlands of stream floodplains, and gathering of a wild range of aquatic and terrestrial plant foods. The bays were located behind barrier islands that offered protection from the high-energy wave action of the open Gulf of Mexico. The shallow water bay environments were rich in fish such as black drum, redfish, speckled sea trouts, Atlantic croaker, and marine catfishes that could be taken in huge numbers by netting or by shooting with bows and arrows. Shellfish, including bivalves, that is oysters, clams, and scallops, and gastropods, that is whelks and conchs, could be readily gathered from the shallow bottoms of the bays and lagoons to obtain very edible meat and shells that could be used to make a variety of tools and ornaments. Game, especially larger mammals, deer, antelope, bison, were abundant on the mainland and were a major source of meat protein, fat, hides, and bones that were, like shell, useful in the production of tools and ornaments. The coastal zone was in effect a broad ecozone, a transitional boundary between two major biophysical provinces, the marine environment of the Gulf of Mexico and the terrestrial environment of the flat coastal prairies. As such, the region, that is this whole, that constitutes this road, the region provided indigenous peoples with a range of choices and opportunities in terms of economic resources. It was the richness of their environment that allowed the autochthonous high coastal population density, and people spent much of the annual cycle living in large shoreline fishing camps that housed several hundred people during peak fishing seasons. These were periods of time when they were managed to proto-commoditize their labor power and work together collectively. Now, early Archaic, initial limited occupation of the Texas coast. The early Archaic in the coastal zone dates to between 9,000 and 6,000 BP, where there is archaeological evidence for human occupation in the form of midden deposits composed of the shells of bivalves, such as Rangia clams and oysters. After the initial formation of the bays due to rising sea level 10,000 years ago, there was infilling, as sediments dropped by rivers discharged into bays and accumulated in their bottoms. The early archaic waters around the inland heads of the bays was shallow enough to support the nutrient-rich marshes and grass flats that are the crucial requirements for high biotic productivity that attracted prehistoric people to these shorelines. Now, known sites of the period all along the central coast include the Kendricks Hill site near Lavaca Bay and several sites on Nueces Bay. The deepest and oldest layer of shell midden at Kendricks Hill is a thin but dense deposit of Rangia clamshells radiocarbon dated to 8,200 years BP at 3 sites on bluffs overlooking Nueces Bay, a secondary bay connected to the Corpus Christi Bay, is a basal strata of thin layers of oyster shell. Artifacts are a smattering of chert debitage and flakes. A knife fragment made from an edge-flaked shell of a sunray Venus clam has been excavated, and the 5 to 15 centimeter thin shell deposits and few artifacts indicate short-term occupations for gathering and consuming clams and oysters. Animal bones would have decayed over the last 7,000 years. However, a few fish otoliths, these are ear bones, more resistant to decay than bone have survived, indicating that fishing was part of the subsistence strategy of early archaic people who live along the bay shores. These early migrants from Tamaulipas entered as bands, setting up short-term camps for the purpose of gathering clams and oysters and engaging in limited fishing with some hunting of game done along the way. Projectile points of this time have been recorded as surface finds. These seem to be materials that have eroded from early archaic shell middens exposed by natural and/or artificial ground disturbances. It's reasonable to assume that some hunting was done from these locations. We can also infer that various species of edible plants were gathered and eaten as well. At Buckeye Knoll, located near the banks of the Guadalupe River about 15 miles upstream from the head of San Antonio Bay, a large early archaic cemetery of 90 persons was discovered and partially excavated. Radiocarbon dates on small samples of tooth pulp from many of these individuals place this cemetery between about 7,000 and 6,200 years ago. Analysis of stable isotopes in the tooth pulp, N15 and C13, showed that the diet of these folks consisted of a mixture of terrestrial, riverine, and marine food resources. This is what we would expect for people having made their way from the mountains of the Sierra Madre in Tamaulipas. The terrestrial foods were complemented by the use of coastal fish and shellfish. That brings us to the Middle Archaic along the road. Increasing intensity of coastal occupation and resource use. During the Middle Archaic, between around 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, evidence for human occupation of the shorelines shows a dramatic increase. Campsites along the central coast are more abundant. The first radiocarbon-dated shell middens known for the upper coast now appear. Some sites have yielded a greater quantity of artifacts, including stone atlatl dart points of types such as Bell, Andes, and early triangular, as well as scrapers. Shell strata and sites on Nueces Bay have been dated to this period, including the Mackenzie site. There, excavations recovered several dart points, a unifacial scraper, a fragment of a clear fork gouge, and edge-utilized flakes of chert, and a flake of obsidian. Although bone was not preserved at the Mackenzie site, otoliths representing black drum, redfish, sea trout, and marine catfish prove that fishing complemented the gathering of Rangia flexuosa clams. The Means site, M-E-A-N-S, is another dense Rangia flexuosa midden. It has been radiocarbon dated to 5,300 years BP in association with fish otoliths and numerous examples of early triangular atlatl dart points. Numerous sites near the shoreline of Nueces Bay contain shell strata dating to this period, as do a number of sites of Galveston Bay area on the upper coast, as well as clay dune sites on the northern shore of Baffin Bay. In fact, the entire Texas Gulf Coast was occupied at this time. There is a general increase in the number and range of artifacts than was the case during the early Archaic. A site on a clay dune on the northern shore of Baffin Bay contains several discrete strata of archaeological debris. The lowest of them contained a very thin lens of oyster shells and charcoal dating 5,900 to 5,300 BP. On the upper coast, the shoreline oyster shell middens in the Galveston Bay area are of the same date, and to the south, on the north shore of Baffin Bay, several oyster shell deposits also date to the Middle Archaic. This indicates that the hypersalinity of over 60 parts per thousand that came to characterize Baffin Bay in more recent times did not yet exist at that time. Oysters cannot survive in hypersaline waters. Now, this brings us to a hiatus in the coastal occupation that occurs between 4,000 and 3,000 BP. With over 200 radiocarbon dates available from shell middens along the Texas coast, from Galveston Bay on the upper coast southward to Baffin Bay, a striking pattern becomes clear, namely that throughout this long stretch of coastline there is a notable gap in dates between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago. Now this suggests a marked break in human occupation of the shorelines that lasted roughly 1 millennium. The coast became unattractive as a place to live for hunting and gathering populations. The fish and shellfish that attracted people to the shoreline were available. There had been a rapid rise in sea level to a higher than modern sea level at this time that destroyed the extensive bay shallows. Now these had been providing organic nutrients that supported the biotic food chain, causing a dramatic reduction in populations of primary and secondary consumer species such as crustaceans, mollusks, and smaller fish. Now, the late Archaic, stabilization of sea level, and intensification of human coastal resource use. Geological studies have shown that by 3000 BP, the sea level became stable at its modern position. Ongoing deposition of sediments by wave action and shore drift created the modern barrier island chain a few miles offshore. Broken only by a series of tidal passes, the barrier islands protect the bays and lagoons from high-energy wave action. The accumulation of river-deposited sediments within the bays re-established the extensive shallows that provided organic nutrients in the form of decaying plant matter. This resulted in a dramatic increase in the abundance of the shellfish and fish species. In turn, people returned to exploit these resources. By the end of the late Archaic, there was a peak in fish as a dietary staple along this land bridge from Tamaulipas. Shoreline shell middens of this period are more numerous than for all earlier periods. Sites are much larger, with thicker accumulation of shell and other occupation debris. On the central coast of the Kent Crane site on Copano Bay is a shell midden over 5 feet thick that extends along a shoreline bluff for nearly a mile. Excavations recovered many stone tools, including dart points of late Archaic types, and many shell tools, including conch shell adzes and gouges, sunray Venus clam shell scrapers, and perforated oyster shell net weights. The outer body whorl sections of whelk shells were also used to make pendants and other items of personal adornment. Bone artifacts, including awls and pins with engraved decorations made from deer long bone splinters, as well as beads fashioned from tubular sections of bird bones. Also recovered were fragments of asphalt. Now, asphalt is a black tar substance that originates from petroleum seepage in the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. It washes onto Gulf beaches on the barrier islands as a part of a natural process. Now, late Archaic people used asphalt as a coating, collected this material on baskets. Some of the Kent Crane basketry has clear impressions of woven basketry. Asphalt was glue for securing projectile points to wooden shafts, and the dart points for atlatls, from Kent Crane have traces of asphaltum still adhering to the basal sections that were inserted into the wooden foreshafts of darts. Now, radiocarbon dating on shells from the bottom of the Kent Crane midden produced an age of 2800 BP for the beginning of intensive occupation at the site. The Mustang Lake site is a massive late Archaic shell midden on the shoreline of a saltwater inlet of that name that is connected to San Antonio Bay. This site extends along the Mustang Lake shoreline for a distance of 1 mile. Where tested by excavation, attains a thickness of approximately 5 feet. Consisting mostly of densely packed oyster shells, this deposit has also yielded profuse quantities of fish bones and a series of radiocarbon dates, the earliest of which falls, as in the case of Kent Crane, at 2800 BP. Hundreds of perforated oyster shells and other tools of shell, such as conch columella gouges and conch shell hammers, can be seen along the shoreline beach where wave action has eroded the edge of the midden. Not all shoreline sites on the central coast of this period are as large as Kent Crane and Mustang Lake. Many smaller sites covered thousands of square meters and contained densely packed shells of oysters, large quantities of fish bones, and otoliths, along with stone and shell tools. Examples are the Swan Lake site on Copano Bay, the Guadalupe Bay site on Guadalupe Bay, which is an inland extension of San Antonio Bay, the Kendricks Hill site near Lavaca Bay, and the Ingleside Cove site on the northeastern shore of Corpus Christi Bay. On the upper coast, the late Archaic is represented by dozens of known shell midden sites along the shorelines of Galveston and Trinity Bays, as well as Clear Lake, a secondary bay connected to Galveston Bay. Mostly these are dense deposits of Rangia cuneata clam shells, among which are often found oysters and shells of other bay species. These sites generally cover several thousand or more square meters, and excavations have recovered various late Archaic chipstone dart points and other tools, shell and bone tools and ornaments, and the bones of fish, turtle, deer, and other terrestrial species. The late Archaic of the lower coast is less well known. Its sites are not shell middens, consisting of fish bones and otoliths, as fishing was the economic mainstay in this area, as it was to the north. Cemetery sites in the Rio Grande Delta area date to the late Archaic, as do many shell ornaments. And that brings us to the late prehistoric period, which featured intensive fishing along the coastal territories and the introduction of the bow and arrow and pottery. The Archaic ends and the late prehistoric begins on the road from Tamaulipas with the introduction of the bow and arrow, which replaced the atlatl and dart as the primary tool for hunting. Ceramic technology features containers for food and for storing and cooking and serving food. Now, the bow and arrow appears along the coast by AD 800, as do scalorn arrow points along the upper coast and the northern part of the central coast. Farther south in the Corpus Christi area, unnotched, unstemmed, triangular arrow points of the Fresno type are the earliest arrow points on Ingleside Cove, and they date to AD 1000. Still farther down the coast, various unstemmed and unnotched arrow point types such as Cameron, Star, and Lozenge are dominant. Ceramic technology appears earliest on the upper Texas coast, where early pottery types date 300 BC. In Galveston Bay, the earliest pottery appears about AD 100 as Chefonte ware, closely related to pottery of the same name to the east in Louisiana. Thus, the land bridge from Tamaulipas to the USA eastern woodlands terminates. Excavations at the Eagles Ridge site near the Trinity River Delta produced a large number of sherds of the Chefonte pottery radiocarbon dated to 400 BC. This finding suggests that the Chefonte pottery of the upper Texas coast is as old, or nearly as old, as that from Louisiana. Clearly, the road from Tamaulipas was well traveled by this time. By AD 100, upper coast pottery assemblages were the sandy paste ceramics of the Goose Creek series. Pots were undecorated Goose Creek plain and featured geometric patterns of the Goose Creek incised type. The Hopewell ATC, Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom, stylistic expressions of the Marksville culture pottery of Louisiana are not yet present. Thus, the road retains its cultural integrity. Nevertheless, the trade routes into Hopewell were well established, and the Mesoamerican complex of corn, beans, and squash was fueling the transition to the slave stage in the eastern woodlands and the road to Cahokia. By AD 1000, this had changed, and upper coast incised designs become the decorative patterns on the Coles Creek, and slightly later Plaquemine traditions of Louisiana and the lower Mississippi Valley. After AD 1000, some upper coast pottery came to be tempered with grog. This is a technology invented in Louisiana of crushed pottery, where hard gravel was rare. Now this is Baytown plain when undecorated, and San Jacinto incised when it bears incised decorations. The decorative motifs of San Jacinto incised were derived from the Goose Creek incised type. The traffic from Tamaulipas was, therefore, flowing both ways. These recurrent interactions between the people of Tamaulipas, the upper Texas coast, and those to the east in Louisiana is reflected in the cultural geography of white contact. Now, by AD 1250, pottery technology had reached the central coast. Sandy paste wares, similar to the Goose Creek plain of the upper coast, are found on the lower Lavaca River in association with scalorn arrow points. The people of the Central Coast were ancestral to the historic Caddo Tribes and were making distinctive pottery by AD 1250. This pottery, known as Rockport ware, is a distinctive trait of the Rockport phase, which has been linked with the Caddo. It is a thin, sandy paste pottery that is sometimes undecorated and called Rockport plain, sometimes decorated with incised markings and called Rockport incised, and it was inspired by Upper Coast styles. It was frequently coated and or decorated with asphalt, decorations consisting of narrow bands of asphaltum painted along the rims of pots. In some cases, vertically oriented sets of parallel squiggly lines are added, and these descend along the outside of jars and oyas, that is, narrow-mouthed vessels. Interiors of these pots were coated with asphaltum, perhaps as a sealant, and exteriors were sometimes partially or completely coated as well. Rockport pottery is typically a Central Coast phenomenon, commonly found from Matagorda Bay in the north to the northern shore of Baffin Bay, 90 miles to the south. Its distribution is the same as the range of the early historic Caddo tribes. The fact that Rockport pottery is found in abundance at the sites of Spanish colonial missions and presidios, where the Karankawas were the primary Indian residents, supports the linkage of this pottery and the Rockport phase with the Karankawa Indians of colonial times. No indigenous pottery has been found at sites on the lower coast where it was never locally produced. Occasionally, examples of post-classic Huastecan ceramics have been found in the Rio Grande Delta area, where pots arrived via trade between local late prehistoric populations and the Huastecan people living along the coastal plain in that section, that is, Huasteca, of Mesoamerica. The local Rio Grande Delta folk on the opening road from Tamaulipas was exchanged shell ornaments for pots and perhaps other items such as jadeite ornaments that are known at sites of the Brownsville complex. By late prehistoric times, the population density of coastal groups was growing rapidly. Fleeing farming families found the new environments north of Tenochtitlan to have a broad spectrum food supply made abundant by intensive fishing. In addition to fish, the peoples of the Gulf, Central, and Upper Coast identified a rich source of animal meat protein in herds of buffalo. These animals had expanded onto the Texas coastal prairies after AD 1250. Bison bones overlooking the rivers and creeks that flow across the coastal plains have been found at numerous Rockport phase hunting camps that are located on these prairie uplands. Such sites are all within around 24 miles from the mainland coastline, which is the same distance inland, noted as the territorial limits of the Karankawa tribes by Euro-American observers in early historic times. The Rockport phase Karankawa people maintained a territorial boundary at this distance from the coast, roughly 24 miles. They found bison and chert within this territorial boundary. Seasonality studies on fish otoliths and oyster shells prove fishing camps had several hundred people during the fall through the early spring. Now, these populations fissioned into smaller kin-based bands during the late spring and summer, and they moved inland along streams to hunt deer and buffalo. Immediately inland from the Karankawa were various groups of different linguistic, ethnic, and cultural identity that were carriers of the culture of the Toya horizon. The Rockport phase is distinguishable by its asphalt-coated decorated pottery that is stylistically distinct from the bone-tempered plain pottery of Toya groups. At the Mellon site near Copano Creek in Refugio County, evidence was found to suggest that coastal Rockport phase people shared a bison hunting camp with inland people who used an artifact assemblage typical of the Toya horizon. Coastal peoples had interaction with interior main road groups proven by the adoption of the standard suite of stone tools the latter used for hunting and butchering buffalo and processing their hides. Such items include Paradis-type arrow points, unifacial end scrapers for hide working, flake drills for hide perforating, and bifacially flaked, often alternately beveled chert knives. Indeed,
Archaeologists cannot tell the difference between Rockport Phase and Toya Horizon campsites near the coastal inland boundary without the very different kinds of pottery associated with each respective cultural group, which makes that distinction possible. Now, by analyzing small samples of human bones from cemetery sites all across the Texas coastal plain, comparing stable nitrogen, that is N15, and carbon, C13, isotopes in the bone, a map can be made. This is a map of the distributions of cemeteries providing a coastal people with marine-oriented diets versus inland groups whose diets were overwhelmingly of inland and freshwater riverine foods. The cemeteries in question date to the late Archaic, indicating that the same basic cultural geography was in place at that time as existed in late prehistoric and early historic times. The human bones from the still earlier cemetery at the Buckeye Knoll site, dating to 7000 BP, show that people buried at this site, which is farther inland than the late Archaic to late prehistoric boundary zone, were using both coastal and inland food resources. Therefore, it's apparent that the boundary did not exist in early Archaic times. It was established during the Middle Archaic or the beginning of the late Archaic around 4000 BP. Integrated, well-established, yet we can conclude that the road from the north of Tenochtitlan along the Gulf Coast was an integrated, well-established zone of its own right by the time of white contact. As the coastal environment increased on biotic productivity over the millennia, it saw a growing human population, and by the beginning of the late Archaic around 5000 BP, the geologically modern road from Tamaulipas offered a rich array of aquatic resources. This led to growing regional populations and the emergence of distinct territorial boundaries between its coastal and interior peoples. Although this boundary was maintained for 3,000 years, it was never so rigid as to prevent exchange of goods and ideas. The native peoples of the Texas coast had distinctive cultures, economic patterns, and languages. However, they were not isolated, and they participated in exchange of materials and ideas with other peoples of the Mexican and Texas interior and coastal groups to the east and the south. And this brings us finally to the Caddo, C-A-D-D-O. The Caddo were living in the area of Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Texas between 200 BC and AD 800. The Wichita and Pawnee tribes speak Caddoan languages. By AD 800, this society had begun to coalesce into the Caddoan Mississippian culture. Thus, it is a permanent anchor on the road to Tamaulipas in the culture area of the eastern woodlands of North America. Some villages were ATC, that is, Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom, headquarters. From there, the theocrats directed the construction of major earthworks serving as temple mounds and platforms for residences of the elite ranks. The flat-topped mounds were arranged around leveled, large, open plazas, kept clean and used for ceremonial occasions that were the central feature of the unifying ATC Caddoan religion. By AD 1000, the archaeological Caddoan was extant. The Caddo people had a diet based on cultivated maize, that is corn, sunflower, pumpkins, and squash, as well as domesticated and wild turkeys. Of course, they continued to gather their traditional staple of wild plants. By AD 1200, the Caddoan ATC consisted of many villages, hamlets, and farmsteads. The economy had transformed from native domesticates to extensive maize agriculture that was producing a surplus supporting artisans and craftspeople. By the time of white contact, the Caddoan ATC had become a slave stage kingdom. The Caddo were farmers and enjoyed good growing conditions most of the time. The Piney Woods, geographic area where they lived, suffered the great drought of AD 1276 to 1299. Even so, their irrigation system allowed the maintenance of Caddo's slave stage society until the coming of the Europeans. The Spiro Mounds near the Arkansas River in present-day southeastern Oklahoma, that is what's called Little Dixie, were the most elaborate mounds in Gringolandia. They were made by the Mississippian ancestors of the historic Caddo and Wichita tribes, and what is considered the westernmost point of the Mississippian culture, that is in reality the eastern anchor of the road from Tamaulipas. Archaeological evidence has confirmed that the cultural continuity is unbroken from prehistory to the present among these peoples. The Caddoan Mississippian people were the direct ancestors of the historic Caddo people and related Caddo language speakers who encountered the first Europeans, as well as the modern Caddo nation of Oklahoma. Caddo ideology. Caddo oral history of their creation story says the tribe emerged from a cave called Chakanina, or the place of crying, located at the confluence of the Red River of the South and Mississippi River in northern present-day Louisiana. Their leader, named Moon, instructed the people not to look back. An old Caddo man carried with him a drum, a pipe, and fire, all of which continued to be important religious items to the people. His wife carried corn and pumpkin seeds. As people and accompanying animals emerged, the wolf looked back. The exit from the underground closed to the remaining people and animals. The Caddo peoples moved west along the Red River, which they called Bahateno in Caddo. A Caddo woman, Zacata, instructed the tribe in hunting, fishing, home construction, and making clothing. Caddo religion focuses on Kadi Baya, translating to Lord above or Lord of the sky. In early times, the people were led by priests, including a head priest, the Sinesu, who could commune with spirits residing near Caddo temples. A cycle of ceremonies developed around important periods of corn cultivation. Tobacco was, and still is, used ceremonially. Early priests drank a purifying sacrament made of wild olive leaves. In AD 1200, the Caddo territory was invaded by Degahan-speaking peoples. Specifically, these were the Osage, Ponca, Omaha, and Kaw. They left the Ohio River of Kentucky and moved west because of years of warfare with the Iroquois. The Iroquois took control of hunting grounds in that area. The Osage fought the Caddo, pushing them from some of their territory, becoming dominant in what are present-day Missouri, Arkansas, and eastern Kansas. These tribes were settled in their new territory west of the Mississippi before the AD 1750 European contact. Most of the Caddo historically lived in the Piney Woods region of the USA, divided among parts of East Texas, southern Arkansas, western Louisiana, and southeastern Oklahoma. This region extends up to the foothills of the Ozarks. The Piney Woods are a dense forest of deciduous and pinophyta flora, covering rolling hills, steep river valleys, and intermittent wetlands called bayous. Caddo people settled near the Caddo River. When they first encountered Europeans and Africans, the Caddo tribes were organized themselves in three confederacies: the Natchitoches, the Hasinai, and the Caddo Hadacho. They were affiliated with other neighboring tribes, including the Yowani, a Choctaw band. The Natchitoches lived in northern Louisiana, the Haisane in East Texas, and the Caddo Hadacho near the border of Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. And that brings us to a conclusion of our discussion of the Tamaulipas Road. And in that part of North America, we've seen that how the mountains of Mexico were highways, in a sense, into the southwest and then into the eastern woodlands along the Gulf Coast. Now we're going to, in the next lecture, I'm going to move on to the state of Florida, which was not a part of New England as far as the Englishmen were concerned, or the Frenchmen, or the Germans, because the Spanish had already grabbed it, the parts of it that they could occupy, and the rest of it was pretty independent from quite warlike chiefdoms or early slave stage kingdoms, and we're going to review all of that in the next lecture, and that'll kind of shut it down for today.